So let's talk about threat vectors. Now that we've sort of wrapped up the threat actors, let's talk about how they will conduct or gain access to a network. So you might not think it, but an advanced nation-state attacker and a script-kiddie attacker, they differ wildly in their sophistication, capability, persistence, and pretty much every measure across the board. It's a complete opposite end of the spectrum. However, their tools, attacks, and capabilities generally have a lot in common. Attacking a network, whether you're very sophisticated or a script kiddie or not very skilled, is pretty much using the same core concepts of what needs to be done, generally how it's done, but what sort of separates that is the effectiveness and stealth at which they are applied, the skill involved. Essentially, a threat vector is the path that an attacker will take to gain access to a network, an application, or system. So an attacker wants to get on your network. They have the goals, they have the means, they have the capability. They just need a way, a channel, a path to get into that network. That could be sending somebody an email. That can be a misconfigured server. That can be a known vulnerability on a physically or publicly accessible appliance. Whatever it is, they can take advantage of that, and that was the vector that they gained access. One thing to note, an attacker may use many threat vectors or even a chain of threat vectors to accomplish their objective. To understand what this is, think of a web application, and the web application has no real critical vulnerabilities, but it has a series of small, low-threat misconfigurations. Now, each individual threat vector isn't that serious, and the organization might not think it too concerning to fix them immediately. However, a threat actor might be able to chain them by using all of these misconfigured states in a chain of sequences. They've now gained critical access to something in the network. They've turned all of these low-yield threat vectors into a high-quality, high-threat vector. So let's look at one of the most common threat vectors in use today, and that's social engineering. And social engineering is primarily applied in the form of phishing, which is essentially sending emails to unwitting users that are more tailored to their organization. So how does phishing differ from spam? Spam is what you usually get in your inbox that's really generic. We all seen spam. It's not targeted at us. You could tell it's just generic in the sense that they send it out to thousands of emails at a time. However, phishing is sophisticated in the sense that it is targeted. Somebody took the time to learn about you or your organization. They're aware that your organization is having a holiday party next week, and they send out an email looking for donations for the holiday party, right? And they're hoping that users provide, credentials or, banking details or what have you. Whatever their objectives are, they're going to do some kind of a tailored message to trick users into going along with the ruse. And they do this by playing on people's emotion, the cultural norm, peer pressure. And in some cases, they want to incite panic. They might say, if you don't call us in 10 minutes or you don't log into your account in the next 5 minutes, you're going to lose access and it's going to be a $50 fee or whatever it is. We've all seen those types of emails. But essentially, they're playing on our culture, our emotion, and how we deal with situations to incite a reaction from a user. Social engineering is only effective if the victim falls for it or goes along with it. Social engineering completely fails if the user ignores it. And that's essentially some of the best things we can do is teach people to identify social engineering and phishing, alert it to the organization, and then they ignore it and move on. That essentially mitigates it. So social engineering doesn't have to come just through email. It can be instant messages, text messages, social network, your LinkedIn. There's many stories, you can go look them up online, of threat actors friending people on LinkedIn, and they built a fake profile to make it look like they worked at the same organization. And they just, over a couple weeks, months, struck up conversations about work and what was going on, and gained insider information as to how that organization operated, and again, used that information against the organization. So that is an example of, a long-term social engineering campaign, but it is done. So let's look at some threat vectors in relation to malware or malicious software. I think the scariest one that you can come across is a rootkit. A rootkit is a special kind of malware, and essentially it embeds itself within the operating system. The operating system is essentially referred to as the kernel. and it runs in memory. And a rootkit burrows itself within the operating system, and it renders most detection methods ineffective. Even if you're running antivirus, even if you are running, forensic scans, or you're doing various, triage analysis, a good rootkit can hide from even skilled incident responders and forensic analysis. And then we've got Trojans, another type of malware, but this malware hides in legitimate software. So you go online and you want to download an image converter, and you need this image converter because you've got a report due. And unfortunately, the website that hosts that software had really lax security, and an attacker was able to compromise the server and copy down that software and then put their own malicious software inside of it, that Trojan inside, and then they re-uploaded it to the server so that any unsuspecting user who comes along to that website and downloads the converting software is now infecting themselves with malware. Then there is the worm malware. A worm is a self-propagating and replicating piece of code. What's interesting about a worm is that it doesn't need anything else to replicate or run. A virus, which isn't listed here because it's pretty much the general de facto malware we all think about, a virus is something that needs a host. And a virus runs within a file. You download a malicious PDF, it's got a virus in it. A virus can be used to get a Trojan on a machine. It can be used to get a worm on a machine, a botnet, whatever it is. Viruses can be used for all of those things. But what makes a virus and a worm differ is that a virus needs a file for execution, needs a human to move that file from one machine to the next and to double click it to execute it. Whereas a worm, once it's running once, it self-replicates and gets itself running on other machines connected to the same network. So worms are very devastating pieces of malware if they are able to run unchecked. A botnet is a piece of malware that is used to control infected computers. We refer to infected computers as zombies, and these zombie machines are part of a very large botnet. And when you hear about denial of service attacks, if you play Xbox or PlayStation, usually around Christmas, you'll hear about a large denial of service attack or a distributed denial of service attack that's used to bring down those gaming services, making my children very, very sad on Christmas morning. But that is usually the act of a large botnet. And a hacker, when they own a botnet, they're referred to as a bot wrangler. They use a command and control server to issue commands to this extremely large botnet. There have been botnets that have had millions of infected machines within one bot network. And think of the damage you can cause when you tell a million machines to all go to, Xbox.com or a particular service there. You can bring that service down. So a botnet can be a very devastating tool, and it is a very, very common attack that pretty much everybody experiences. Denial of service attacks are happening almost to every single IP address all the time, 24 hours a day, in some way, shape, or form or another. And that means our home internet devices and routers are subjective to these types of attacks. We have logic bombs. Essentially, this is malware that idly waits for a defined event or sequence of events to occur. That could simply be don't execute until 6 months have passed, or when the user boots their computer and they click start and then run Outlook, then run the malware. So a logic bomb is just looking for a defined event before it carries out its defined action. As previously discussed, ransomware is a type of malware that encrypts local and network files and holds them for ransom. Now, ransomware have used worm methodologies or mechanisms. So imagine a ransomware that has worm capabilities. It can self-replicate, self-propagate, and every machine it touches, it encrypts everything and then demands that the device or system owner pay them a ransom. There have been many organizations, if you look up online, that have paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to ransomware, and ransomware owners for very successful campaigns have made hundreds of millions of dollars over their lifetime. So ransomware has become an extremely lucrative operation, and that's why a lot of organized crime utilize ransomware. But a little bit newer is the use of crypto mining. So a lot of organized crime and threat actors are using crypto mining. So very much like ransomware, it's a malware that gets on your system, but instead of encrypting and holding it ransom, they just said, hey, why don't we just start consuming the victim source resources, your CPU, and start computing cryptocurrency hash values. So if I can create money by computing crypto hashes, the user doesn't know I'm there running, then no harm, no foul. We're going to make money, and we have a higher chance of running without being detected. So crypto mining has seen a huge surge in the last 2 years of activity versus ransomware. So let's look at some threat vectors associated to applications. This can be applications on your computer, your mobile device, a web application, pretty much an application, software. One of the first ones is a drive-by download. So a malicious website or a compromised website doesn't necessarily have to be malicious, but an actor could have manipulated the site. When you visit it, you get a prompt to download something. I'm sure almost everybody has been to a website that immediately prompted you to download a Flash update, or hey, here's a PDF download. Whatever it is, you must be cautious about these types of download prompts. These drive-by downloads try to take advantage of humans' innate ability just to click a button really fast without really reading. And if you do that, you may download and execute a piece of malicious software which would give a remote user access to your computer. As we talked about when we talked a little bit about botnets, a distributed denial of service attack is essentially a flood of traffic or a manipulation of network traffic protocols or even application protocols to cause it to become unstable or even crash. So again, botnets are usually the culprit of large distributed denial of service attacks. We've got brute force attacks. Essentially, this is programmatic attempts to guess the credentials and gain access to a restricted portion of an application. You want to get credentials and log into some web application, you can essentially programmatically make thousands and thousands of guesses until you find a credential pair that matches username and password. SQL injection has been around for quite some time. It's becoming somewhat not as effective, but there's still a lot of vulnerable servers out there. But essentially, SQL is a type of query language that allows applications to communicate with databases and systems to communicate with databases. A misconfigured web application that talks directly to a SQL database, if input validation is not managed, a remote user might be able to inject malicious or fraudulent SQL statements that get the database to do some level of work on behalf of that statement. And it can be anything from return the values of the database, delete values in the database, dump the database, or even execute this malicious code on my behalf. Misconfigured applications is just as critical to all of these other types of attacks. Having software installed without it being configured or hardened to reduce its attack surface is a wide open door for attackers who know how to abuse those standard or default configured software. Many pieces of software come with default credentials that are enabled unless you disable them. So you can see the challenge and damage that can be caused by trying to track all of your applications and their states of configuration and ensuring that all these default settings are turned off, and how easy it is for an attacker simply to scan around on the internet looking for web servers that are using default credentials. We then have misconfigured cloud services. So as we talked in the past, more organizations are using cloud services. It's adopting at a breakneck pace. And as more users use these cloud services to host data, users, applications, the complexity of securing that data also increases. You don't have the same level of control over cloud assets as you do as those running in your network. So as you've seen in the news with users uploading confidential data to a cloud storage and not protecting it appropriately, it was found by others and shared online, or systems aren't hardened appropriately and they're attacked. Whatever it may be, misconfigured cloud services are becoming an extremely concerning threat and a great attack vector for threat actors. Last but not least, the good old exploit. This is essentially software that is designed to take advantage or get unintended execution in an application's memory. So if you know of an application that's vulnerable and you can force it to execute your code, and your code gives you remote access or privilege inside of that application's memory, you've just built an exploit. So let's look at some threat vectors for the network. So some common attack vectors for the network are spoofing. So this involves sending malicious or incorrect network traffic. This is trying to manipulate systems. We can use this to hide things. We can tunnel data through a non-standard protocol. We can disrupt the operability of a system. and we can manipulate network communications. A server might be expecting a specific response, but we can spoof a fake response that could cause the system to have an issue. So spoofing goes hand in hand with a denial of service, which is similar to a distributed denial of service attack, which we've talked about before. But a denial of service is essentially any time a threat actor can cause, as its name says, a denial of service or availability of that service is lost. So spoofing malicious packets to a device that causes that device to fail is a denial of service attack that used a spoofing technique. Man-in-the-middle attacks are attacks that sound just as they are. It's where the threat actor puts their self in the middle of the communication, which allows them to intercept communications, extract credentials, manipulate the traffic, change the traffic, redirect users to websites that they did not intend to go to. There's a myriad of things that can be done, but essentially a man-in-the-middle attack is when the actor manipulates the communications by forcing themselves to be the central point of communication. They proxy the communications and manipulate them. We then have protocol manipulation. This is used a lot in data exfiltration. An actor, once they gain access to the network, a threat actor, they need to get data out of the network. And that's sometimes easier said than done. But one of the techniques they can use is tunneling or hiding their exfiltrated data in a common standard protocol and use it in ways that it wasn't intended. One such way is the DNS protocol, which essentially is the phone book for the internet. We use DNS to look up the IP address for the associated website name. So facebook.com has a corresponding IP address, which is a logical address that's used for routing and connecting two computers over the internet. But we can use DNS because it has the ability to send a text block, a free-form field of just text. Well, all data is just ones and zeros that can be represented in text ASCII characters. So there have been many instances in which the DNS protocol has been used to exfiltrate data or binary data out of the network using ASCII character encoding. Adversaries will scan in a network. Once they gain access to the network, they need to get a lay of the land. So they can use scanning, which is essentially actively communicating with hosts on the network, sending packets from the victim machine to other machines in the network, systems and services, to ascertain what is running, what is online, what vulnerabilities may or may not exist, and how are those devices configured. This helps them assess how they might move within the network to the next victim, so on and so forth, till they gain access to their ultimate objective. Also, with scanning, they can do passive network collection, which is essentially collecting network traffic from the point of presence that they are at. So if threat actor is on a device, a threat vector could be them collecting network traffic passively. As packets of data are sent to them, they collect it and analyze it to see if there's something that they can extract from it. There are many authentication protocols which you can extract the authentication tokens and use that for your own advantage to move laterally in the network. So in summary, threat actors are defined by their characteristics, behaviors, and objectives. Sometimes those objectives can be aligned with geopolitical issues, and that helps us better understand their objectives and goals, and conversely, how we can defend and mitigate those types of attacks. Regardless of sophistication and capability, at the end of the day, threat actors use many of the same types of threat vectors to attack networks: social engineering, exploits, spoofing, denial of service. Whether they do a crude implementation or very sophisticated, by definition, they're all doing the same types of attacks. So there's really not a lot of new stuff out there, just a repurposing of older techniques and reapplying them with a new flair and a little bit of sophistication to provide some new capability and access.